To that.
Sure. To discuss these, Sarah and I are joined by Alpesh Patel from Perfinium Partners. Good to see you again, Alpesh. Straight into Greece, Wall Street Journal. I just wonder, as you watch these scenes on the streets of Athens and, in other places in Greece, one wonders whether these, austerity measures can be implemented in the face of such strong public opposition.
Actually, when I watch those scenes on the streets of Greece, I think about a longer context, actually. I think about, you might think I'm a little bit off the mark here, I think about this Greek tragedy in the context of King Leonidas, who led 300 Greek Spartans to their deaths to ensure they did not become enslaved. I think about Alexander the Great, who at the time formed the largest empire the world has ever known, again, to ensure Greeks would not become enslaved. But today, or yesterday, the Greek Parliament has pretty much voted in favour of ensuring the Greeks become an enslaved nation.
But there was no other option.
Yes,
At least that's what Europe would like us to believe.
That's what Europe would like us to believe, and the markets have rallied as a result of the Greeks saying, yes, we will try. Our population of whatever it is, 25 million in Greece, 25 million people are going to pay this many billions? I don't think so. And you're absolutely right, they're not going to pay it.
One analyst that we spoke to on World Business Report said it's an escape, it's not a solution. What do you think the solution will be then in the end?
They will ultimately default. They cannot afford to pay this debt. There's not enough people earning enough money. And yes, they shouldn't have got themselves into this mess. They shouldn't have believed all the clever bankers who said you should be in the euro. They shouldn't have had the kinds of holidays they have, the early retirement ages, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, the burden will fall upon those people who did not benefit from this. In actual fact, it'll be the people who are being hurt the most, who can least afford to pay these debts, who will be inflicted the most with the rising taxes and the lowering incomes.
Well, in the meantime, in the UK, of course, we have this public sector strike, which is now underway. What kind of parallels would you draw with that one?
Well, it'd be too easy to say, oh, it's part and parcel of the same problem. At a very top level, of course it is. It's all part of the global crisis, or at least let's put it this way, the Western crisis. It's not actually a global crisis. And the problem here is that people, particularly working in the public sector, who believe they were going to get, some would say, a generous pension pot, aren't. Well, I've got news for you. You were lied to. You were lied to that your country is rich and can afford these pensions. You were lied to that you're actually going to retire on these sums. You're not. Like so many others, you're actually going to get a heck of a lot less. Your pension, your retirement is going to be a little bit less comfortable. But when you look at the figures in some of the newspapers, it's still going to be rather comfortable. One thing's for sure, there doesn't seem to be as much public support for the strikers as the strikers and the unions would like you to believe. And the reason for that is because the rest of us, well, in the UK it's 5 a.m., the rest of us are having to work.
Well, that kind of a reality check that you speak of, that over the long term we're not going to be retiring with as much money as we expected, isn't that going to lead to more strikes, a season of strikes, as more and more workers become, are confronted with this reality?
No, actually what's going to end up happening is that they're going to swallow the bitter pill and say, you know what, we're going to actually have to work a little bit longer, we're not going to get as much money, but then again, neither is anybody else in the public sector, and those in the private sector, well, they've been stuffed for a while because they don't know if their jobs are going to be around either. So I think to that extent, given that we're all going to be in the same sinking boat, I think they're not going to get very far on the strike side of things.
Let's look at the failure of yet another tie-up between stock markets. This time it's the London Stock Exchange with TMX Group. This is the Canadian group. Now, this is the third proposed tie-up in 9 months, I think, that has failed to come to fruition. How big a blow is it, do you think?
Well, London Stock Exchange has been looking for a bride or a groom, depending on which way you want to look at it, for quite a while. And I'm not saying that they make an ugly spouse, but they're not getting very far. And it's not just them. It was Australia and Singapore which didn't manage to tie up. The problem that you get in these mergers when exchanges are involved is nationalism. And certainly that's what's being put down to. The shareholders on the Canadian side, despite the fact that the Canadians are a dominion of the United Kingdom, don't all of a sudden sudden like to be merging with, let's say not taken over by, but merging with the major UK exchange. And that's the problem it looks like you're going to get with other mergers around the world as well, is the nationalist sentiment, as opposed to just the pure hard-headed business sense that does this, reduce costs and increase turnover.
But what do you think drives that nationalism? Because as you point out, this is not the first time. It's not just with the LSE, because one would assume that, you know, the most important color is the color of money.
Yes, it is, but the shareholders, whilst looking at obviously whether or not their share prices will rise, are also fearful of losing control. And clearly they don't believe they're going to make as big a return as if they stay single.
Do you think it will make the London Stock Exchange a bid target, as this article is suggesting?
Well, it has been for a while, and it probably will be again, but I suspect the bigger problem is going to be somebody's going to look at this and say, what's the point of bidding, when we know ultimately if it's not the viewpoint on flying the flag, then it's going to be the regulatory concerns, and the deals are going to be too complicated. It's not going to happen. So I suspect what's going to happen is people are going to look at this and say, you know, we don't want to incur the enormous legal expenditure whenever you do mount one of these bids.
Moving on to the global edition of the New York Times, Bank of America's set aside cash for a big bailout, $14 billion. Do you think Wall Street is now learning the lessons of the subprime crisis, learning now that they're being hit in the pocket?
Yeah, sure. Right. Wall Street's going to learn a lesson. Yeah, right. No, the great thing about this story is the $14 billion is the settlement between banks. So it's what Bank of America is largely paying other banks. And what I love about this story is it's not just us that the banks, us private investors, private individuals that the banks sell rubbish to. The great story is that they've turned on their own and they've been selling so much rubbish
to each other.
To each other. And this is what the $14 billion is set aside. So to you and I, look, it's not going to make any difference because it's actually just going to go from one set of, I can't say the words I want to say because it's TV, but you know what I'm thinking. It's going to go from one set of those people to another set of those people. So that's in one sense fine.
But I'm down to us in some ways or another, doesn't it?
Probably not. You know, your central bank is just going to issue a lot more worthless money. So you're already stuffed. Don't worry, it's not going to trickle down to us.
And looking at what the IMF says, that the US must raise its debt limit, echoing, of course, what many people have been saying for a long time, but making the point this has got to be sorted as soon as possible.
Yeah, the Americans have limits on how much money they can borrow and how indebted they can get. You might think that's a good idea, given that the Americans have a tendency to just borrow like crazy. And it is. The problem is they keep on raising this debt ceiling, so it doesn't really count. And at the moment, they're going to run out by August 2nd. What's interesting about this is that the Americans owe $1 trillion to the Chinese, $1 trillion to the Japanese, who've bought their debt, and $300 billion to the Brits. So those people who are striking on the streets, guess what? Your government lent all the money to the Americans. That's why your pensions are not going to get paid. Okay,
now we'd love to talk about Roger Federer, the outgoing champion, some would see it, but we got to ask you about Murray.
He's going to win. He's going to win. He's going to beat Nadal, although Nadal looks like he's a winner. Yeah. Trust me, Nadal's going to choke. Nadal, you're watching this because you've just got up and this is the first thing you're watching. You're going to lose. Look into my eyes. You're going to lose.
Alpesh will bring you back on that. See what happens. There. Thanks so much. As a reminder of the main news, the Greek Parliament is today resuming the debate on the bitterly contested austerity program. More ahead here on BBC News.
Bye-bye.